Hello, DrupalCon. We are back again at the main stage. My name is Tim Lennon. I'm the CTO here at the Drupal Association, and today it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you Mitchell Baker, another hero in open source after we've just awarded Baddie Sonia with that honor within our Drupal community. But Mitchell is really a giant in all of the open source communities that we are a part of. She is the chair of the board of Mozilla and the CEO of the Mozilla Foundation and Corporation at this time, and has been focused for decades on accelerating the growth of the Firefox open source browser and of advancing the value of open source in the world in general. So we're thrilled to have her here. Please join me in welcoming her in the chat, and I'll hand it over to you, Mitchell. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. "2020, what a year. More things than we could not have expected. And one thing is clear. The internet is everywhere. And the open source that underlies it is everywhere. And yet, it's not healthy. The internet is not healthy. The open source that underlies it is not always seen. And our societies are not healthy either. And the internet and society, the network and society, the open source that underlies it, are completely interwoven. The internet affects, for those of us who are online, the half of humanity, nearly everything. We can't have a healthy society if the internet and the software and the data and the code that underlie it are unhealthy. And so there's been a lot of talk this year about how 2020 is different, what's gone wrong, the COVID, misinformation. But I want to apply the lens of open source and look at the topics of today through the lens of open source. And this is really the perfect place to do it, because the 20th year of Drupal, such a milestone, and a 20 years of Mozilla as well. So two venerable, long-term, successful, evolving open source communities. Two projects that have a open source core, contributors, a community ethos, some businesses built on top of them, and impact not just for open source, but also for our users, consumers, and in the market. And so this is a perfect place, and I'm really feeling privileged to be able to come back to DrupalCon, virtually at least, and join together in thinking about open source. So the 20 years seems important to me for a couple of different reasons. And for those of us who've been there for a while, I invite you to think back. Think back to the beginning, or to your earlier memories of open source, because 20 years, a lot has changed. I was a spokesperson for open source way back when, I say in the time before time. That's the time before the internet archived everything. And so it's not possible to find those materials today. But consistently, by press around the world, I was asked a series of questions. And if you've been involved in open source for a while, you may remember some of these questions too. This was the understanding. The idea of open source and open was odd. It was sort of crazy. In the US, it was labeled socialist, but it was generally not understood. And these questions were very real. Like, how in the world could it possibly work? And why would people do something that wasn't employment? They seemed like odd questions to me, but they were everywhere. Now, today, things are quite different. Open source is mainstream. For many people, it's just what you do. You go to GitHub. Even in our success and mainstream application of open source, it's even gone beyond communities. But not only is open source mainstream, but we have open almost everything. You name it. I put a few here: science, data, government, journalism. But you could pick almost any topic and add the word open in front of it, and someone is working on that. And I know that because those people used to call me in the early days, email really in those days, but I would get an email. I'd wake up and there'd be someone trying to practice open something and trying to learn from the open source movement. How did we build community? How did we track issues online? What was the decision-making process? And we see that that has moved into all manner of topics, but it's also gone even broader, because today we live in part in what is sometimes called the sharing economy. And you'll see I've put Airbnb and Uber there as examples of that. It's maybe hard to remember, and for those who are younger, maybe hard to imagine, the idea of sharing in homes or cars, it wasn't just crazy like open source, it just didn't exist. But the idea that you would open your home to a stranger, just like not in consciousness. Maybe a little bit in the hostel culture, and when I traveled through Europe, you might find people, but as a general matter, no. Or that cars, you would not need to own your own car because the system has plenty and you would share it. This just didn't exist. And so in these things, we see both the technology has enabled it, we'll say the network in these cases, and the open source technology that underlies it, and the applications that can be built on top of it. So these things are enabled by technology, but also deeply influenced by the ideas of open. And this change happened quickly. From a decade ago, let's say 15 years ago at the very most, where the idea of open source was crazy, and the sharing economy wasn't even an idea till today, where increasingly we use these models. And so this is an example of how the thinking that emerged and became real in technology and open source and technologist communities has influenced and spread and touches all of modern networked society. Now, I'm not saying that open source alone drove these changes. I think there are many changes in a society that will drive this kind of culture shift and economic shift. But open source was an early concrete manifestation of some ideas that were sort of crazy at the time. You would voluntarily work together. You might do things where you didn't get paid. You would voluntarily build a community. That community would voluntarily figure out how to govern itself and manage conflict and make decisions and move forward. And that the end result of that work would be shared. These were ideas that we demonstrated in open source, again, at a time when it was really quite crazy. And we can see that these ideas, along with the technology, have moved into the broad social awareness and organization. And so that, for me, is a very hopeful sign about the power of our communities, the power of technology married to community, married to a conscious thinking of how do we operate and what do we do and what's better and how should we change. That core of open source has brought so much into the world, and given all the problems today, the evolution of open source has the opportunity to bring more into general awareness, society, and consciousness. And sometimes that change happens quickly. Now, the change from open source into mainstream society was not actually overnight. There was maybe the decade or so of the GNU Linux operating system going from compiler to full operating system. Then there were a range of other open source projects, early Apache work, then Mozilla, and then Drupal, and then a whole range. So there was a lot going on in the background. But when it came to consumer consciousness, of which Firefox was a part of, I won't say the only thing, but one of the early ways in which general society learned about open source was through the early spike of Firefox. Once it arrived, we had been practicing these ideas for long enough that they were very real and pretty well formed. And so as it moved through general social consciousness, it actually happened very quickly. And so from this, as I say, I'm optimistic that open source communities and projects like ours can continue to bring new ideas about social collaboration and the creation of work product like software and systems, which are hard, into social consciousness and help continue to contribute to improving the world that we live in here. And for this, there's a few general ideas that I think are good starting points. And so one, the idea of open itself. Like open is a powerful idea. Sometimes when I think back to the economic model, we'll say of the end of the last century, it was increasingly closed and increasingly about intellectual property and how big or small a piece could you own. And so the idea of open and collaboration was radically different. And we can see how powerful it is. In the internet is not that old, right? Maybe a lifetime, maybe a human lifetime. And look what's happened in it. So the internet built on open source, open standards, open societies, open collaboration. And so that idea is really powerful. We don't want to lose it. Sometimes I hear advocates of open internet or what we used to call the open web or even the web as discouraged and worried about the idea of open because of today's problems. And yes, we have to address today's problems, but let's not lose sight of the power of open and the opportunity that it provides, potentially for all as we improve. The ability to participate, contribute, create, and building opportunity. So open is powerful. And open as we've understood it before needs to evolve. Open from the early days of the internet is a powerful idea, but of course we've learned there's a bunch of issues that have come out of it. And so when we think about open, I am not advocating looking to the past or thinking that open means anybody can do whatever they want, no matter the damage, but that idea of access and participation and the ability to create that's at the heart of open has to evolve and go forward. One issue that we've seen is that we have beautiful open systems, but increasingly they're wrapped up and surrounded and contained by closed, centralized systems. It's a little bit of the paradox of openness or the paradox of tolerance. And so the ability to do whatever you want with open source or free software has been part of the drive that brings it. But it used to be, we thought that the mechanism for preventing this sort of privatization was the open source license that one chose. And in the early days, if you didn't care about privatization, you chose the university, MIT or BSD licenses, and later the Apache license. And if you did want to prevent the privatization, you chose the GNU public license. But of course, that license is applicable only with the physical distribution of software. And in the services area, of course, we don't have that. And that ability to take a piece of software and use it and never have to show your changes to anyone was part of the philosophical understanding, at least of Richard Stallman of the time. So that was a very intentional feature and important for the development of open source. Today we see, though, that in a services environment, there is no current protection against privatization. And so we don't yet have the mechanisms or the tools to even be able to talk about is the ability to always privatize the end answer in all cases? Should we have tools that allow a choice of that? Maybe some of us would say no, like the freedoms that were first set out in the GNU public license should always be the same, and the ability to privatize as long as it's only on your private servers, no matter how big, like that's an important piece of our ideology and we want to maintain that. Others of us might have something different or look for other tools or other choices. So this is a topic in open source where as we make progress with it, I think there's real hope for our communities, but also more broader, because this paradox of being open to ideas that in fact are going to end up maybe causing changes nobody really wants is a broad social topic. So that's one. Another topic about evolving open source is this one. Last year, I guess, maybe only a year ago, I was in Boston and Dries and I had lunch. And I, with some, trepidation, raised the topic, that I'm starting to hear in open source circles more and more talk about the issues of sustainability and the number of maintainers who have many packages and spend good chunks of their time and life working on open source, but struggle and aren't getting paid and are trying to figure out how do these two things go together. And at first I thought maybe that was a little heretical in open source to talk about that. But, Dries sat up for a moment from lunch and said, well, Mitchell, that's really interesting because I too have thoughts in that kind of area, and I'm working on a blog post about makers and takers. And so sometime later, here it is. And so this question of, maybe to be blunt, what about money? And that the ethos of collaborative work is so powerful, and yet the question of how do we sustain ourselves? I mean, some people actually want to do more than that, and get wealthy. So that might be in the picture as well. But at the very least, how do we sustain ourselves? And what is this balance between those who do the creation and those who reap the benefit? And again, I think this is a topic which indirectly, as we try different examples and hopefully get to some improvements and potential solutions, or at least some options, can have broader application as well. And a third topic is this question of accountability. Because one of the things that's very clear right now is that the open systems and open source have become at least part of a system in which it's hard to see where the accountability is. Because open source and the open systems and the internet itself, were originally created by what I would call a community. And that word now, it means much less, because many of the big platforms will use the word community to mean people who use my product, who aren't in any way a community, meaning they don't identify themselves with a shared identity. They're not necessarily trying to create the same kinds of things. There's no governance mechanism. And so the accountability mechanisms of early open systems were not adequate as those systems became global. Accountability mechanisms inside individual communities like Drupal or Mozilla or Apache, for example, may be working fine for our scale, but that kind of system, when applied to a global network with people, all of human nature and people who really disagree, those are not adequate accountability mechanisms. And we can see that today, where we have even open systems that seem to be playgrounds for trolls and the loudest and most violent and the worst aspects of humanity. And the question of what do you actually do about it, it can be unanswerable. And so this is an area where, once again, I think as our communities grow and we learn more about our own accountability, and as your community and Mozilla grows, then the governance mechanisms also grow, because you have more people, hopefully more diverse people, different perspectives, and the kind of broadening that allows all of us to learn and grow. And those things require more governance perspectives, because you can't walk in thinking we all have the same view, we've all had similar world experiences. We hope in our open source world that's not the case. Excuse me for a minute. Sorry. We hope that that's not the case. And so this question of how do we build accountability for people who don't have the same worldview will be important for our communities, but it's clearly a big question in general, and one which the internet and the global nature of the internet magnifies. So we are working on evolving what open means at Mozilla, and I'll just spend a little time on that. The first thing is our identity. Mozilla has a manifesto, the Mozilla Manifesto. We've had it for 2008, I think it was finalized. You can search for it and find it. It has 10 principles. But recently we added these 4. And in fact, we added these on our 20-year anniversary, so March 31st, 2018. And these are now part of what we think of as the core identity of Mozilla. Some people are drawn to Mozilla. Some people have very deep affiliations, or like a deep affiliation for them is as a Mozillian. I'd be one of those. There are many others, though, for whom there's other primary affiliations, but look towards Mozilla or are interested or have an affiliation or feel partly related to Mozilla, like that you might feel a piece of Mozilla as well as Drupal. And what does that mean? These principles we've added to that identity. Now, they're different. Our first 10 principles were much more system-like. Individual control. An individual should be in charge. Open source. Privacy. Security. Community-based processes. Building transparency and accountability. Building the internet as a global public resource. Those are the manifesto, the first 10 principles. Here you can see we are talking much more about human experience and what is the technology's impact on human experience and human behavior. So this is a change. We have not fully assimilated this change yet. We are working on it. We view, for example, the two in the center there as high-level product direction. When we think about what are the products we should be building, who are the people we want to be supporting, these are actually, product direction. They're not a product. They don't tell you where or how, but the kinds of things that we think of as Mozilla or what would be Mozillian in a product. The first one, that your demographics don't matter, obviously, we haven't assimilated that fully. And that we are, I think like you, deep in the process of how do we actually live that? If these are the values that make us Mozilla, how are we really living them? And the last one, collaboration among diverse groups for the common good. That, to me, is so close to the core of open source. There's the software piece that results from it, but how does the software get created? And that is collaboration among diverse groups working for the common good. And today, we know that the diversity in many open source projects is not adequate. I do also want to remember that the geographic diversity and the ability to participate without employment and without academic credentials was a milestone in its time. In no way do I want that to cover up for lack of racial diversity or gender diversity in our projects. So, I'm not trying to do that at all. I am trying to say that the early phase did have collaboration among sets of people who at the time, that collaboration was seen as radical and unworkable. And we made it work. We as open source communities with the new technology of the network, the internet, we made that work. And so I am convinced that with intent and desire and focus, we can make inclusion and diversity on the axes of today equally successful. So that's part one, who we are and how we think of ourselves and our goals. Second way in which we're working on evolving open is our products. We still think the browser is an important piece and that it's the one piece of the system that can represent you. The thing that I dislike most about my phone is that Apple or Google owns the operating system and the app creator has a complete control over the app that I use and complete control over what the app and the server side and the data does. There's nothing in the middle that represents me. Now, sometimes the operating system will do that, say for some privacy or security piece, but it's completely dependent on what the operating system vendor wants to do. And there's only really two of them, or three maybe if you count Kai, but in much of the world, there's really only two. And so we miss that piece, which the browser represents, which allows you or me or us or Firefox to represent the individual, so that whatever the app maker wants to happen to you, there's something in the way that says, no, wait, I'm a human being. I'm here. I don't want that. So we still think the browser is important for that. But of course, the browser is a tough business to be in. And the competitors, have many, many advantages, including, totally integrated stacks, some of which are near monopolies. And so our view on the browser is really to challenge the idea that it's a commodity. We've heard over and over again, it doesn't really matter, it's a commodity. That was Microsoft's view in 2000. But actually, that's not really true. You could think of like cars. They all do basically the same thing, but they have not been commodities. Maybe in the current generation more so, but but the difference between comfort and fuel efficiency and are they good in snow, there's a lot of things that are still important. So we continue to work on the browser and to provide differentiation. But of course, that's not enough. And so evolving open at Mozilla has got a few other things in it. One is a broad question about fix the internet. Now, my personal preference is to build a better internet. I think that captures more of what I'm focused on, which is not fixing the messes that other people have created, but instead building experiences and the richness of the web and the global network into experiences that are fun and positive and also have the values of our manifesto. So personally, I would say build a better internet, but the team working on this is trying to fix the internet. That team is the Mozilla Builders. I put their logo up there. This is a early effort and an exploration into how broad of a new community is possible based on open source, open values, accountability, evolving open, and building a better internet. Building experiences that aren't so abusive to individuals. Building experiences where there is something in the middle of the system that looks out for you and looks out for me. And building systems that are trustworthy. Not necessarily trusted, which is a very human emotion and often wrong, but trustworthy. What are the systematic characteristics that make our systems trustworthy? And I would place open source right at the core of that because you can see it. And you can understand what it does. And so as a fundamental tenet of trustworthiness, open source has characteristics that you can't match otherwise. And the question of how we go from those characteristics into open data, what does that mean? Does that always mean CC0 for data? Which is, again, a lot like we'll say the MIT BSD kind of license structure. Should it mean something different? And so this question of building communities, the open source movement. Today, open source, as I started with, is mainstream. You just kind of go to GitHub or GitLab, but there was a movement of it which was very conscious. I would say there still is, but the open source world is so much bigger than the movement. But that question of how do we operate? Why do we do this? What does collaboration mean? What does common good mean? What does sharing a product mean? Those kinds of questions are still real. And what is the set of people? We imagine that there are many people who don't identify first and foremost as I'm a member of an open source community for those reasons, but identify elsewhere who care about those things as passionately as the open source community does. And so our builders raise the fix the internet flag is the exploration to see where are those people? Are there many of them? Does this resonate with them? Does the Mozilla logo resonate with them? Can we be part of, or if called for, lead or spark or be a convening or gathering place for the set of people who want something better, who want something, I would say, closer to the ethos and spirit of open source communities in the nature of how we build technology today. And so I expect this to bring changes to Mozilla. I've been the CEO of the product arm Mozilla Corporation for 3 months now, maybe. So those changes are nascent now, but the need to evolve open, the need to evolve where and how we build products, what part of the market we compete in, the need to build a broad community that wants something different and better and trustworthy and open and is tackling the kinds of problems I mentioned before is both paramount in necessity, but I think also an opportunity. These communities, the hunger for something better is real. And finding a way for those of us who are driven to this, to gather together, to make new things together, and to try and experiment in the ways that open source has always done, to build something that might be new, but also something that we understand and that might be better, and that would have some of the values that we have tried to build our communities around, is also a real opportunity. And deeply, deeply necessary, because clearly the power of software, the power of open source, the power of the internet have led to massive social changes and disruptions. And so the source of exploration and improvement, how do we address those disruptions, get the power but build something better? I think open source communities have a tremendous amount to offer here. And our ability to change ourselves, explore among ourselves, and have actual solutions that are working in our communities can be examples, I'm still very hopeful, for much broader application throughout society. And so once again, it's really a privilege to be here, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitchell, for this presentation. It's been fantastic to have you with us and to share some of the history of open source and to confront us with the challenges that we're going to need to face as we evolve open source into the next generation. We do have some questions that came through the chat that I've been taking note of. I'm sure there are a few more that may come in as well, so please, if you do have questions, go ahead and post those to the stage chat as you are watching. A first question that I think I'd like to ask you is about the values discussion. So again, what you have said is that we built these open source communities that we have today around the values of our early communities. And we are now injecting new values into the next generation of what we do with open. I think there are people who often think of open as being the value, as being the central value by itself, and that everything flows from that, instead of being something that's built based on values. Can you just dig into that a little bit more and that misconception that's so common?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. And I want to start and say, like, I'm not sure it's a misconception. I think we're all working to understand open because it has such meaning for so many of us. And yet, is there a canonical definition of what open actually is? And does it mean anyone can do anything at any time with no consequences? Like one meaning of it. And so, in fact, I have I'd call it an early version of a white paper called Reimagining Open. For this very reason, what is it that open captures for us? And I'll bet if we went through the say the DrupalCon attendees or a bunch of Mozilla people, we'd get responses that were kind of similar, but not exactly the same. And so when I spent a lot of time also trying to explain in this question of, no, open is powerful, we need to keep it. And then someone will ask, like a policymaker, well, what are you trying to keep? And so as I've thought about it, what is it that open encapsulates for me? Why do I care about open? And why do I think it's a value, not just a convenient tool? And I come up with a few things. One, I think for open has captured something about the early web, as we really understood it, the earliest internet, the web, and the open source that preceded it. I would say something about access. You know, in software terms, you can get to it. It's available to you. You can use it. You can use it on equal terms. I'd say something about opportunity and making opportunity available more broadly, and something about the ability to create. Like open source software, it's not just that you can see it. You can use it and do what you want with it. You can create without permission. And so I found that exactly the same issue. What is open? And that I need to be able to go further than just to say open. And in particular, when we're trying to talk about human experience, what does that mean? Because it can't just mean anarchy and violence. So in my own process, and I'm not saying this is right or will work for everyone, but in my own process in trying to interrogate open, what does it mean? It's come down to these: access, opportunity, participation, ability to create. And I could, if you gave me a place to do so, make this white paper or point people to it. And see, it's really early. I almost call it I'm going to call it a 1.0 as opposed to an 0.9, but it really is time kind of for a much more broader engagement. We did early community engagements, but I think this might be a good second step.
I think that would be wonderful. I'm sure our audience would be really interested, so I can collect that from you after and pass it into our channels here. Another question that we have is about your earlier slide that talked about open beyond open source software and open applied to other industries and areas. And we have two close questions. How do we apply open to education? And are we actually seeing that in a meaningful way right now? And how do we look at open to apply to elections and politics and policy? Is there an open source, is there an entity like Mozilla trying to solve that problem in that problem space that you might be aware of? So education and policy and politics as applied to open.
I'm going to start on the latter. On the open elections, there are two things that I know about. There's one, it's been around for a good while, the Open Source Voting Association, I believe. An organization, this is one of the organizations that struggled, I think, for 6 or 7 years with the U.S. Internal Revenue Service to be deemed a nonprofit. Because even though elections are supposed to be public benefit, the fact that it was open source held it up for so long, so you can tell it's infuriating. And so struggled for a long time. And I'm not actually sure if they're still active, so apologies for that, but they may be. Then there's another one called Voting Rights, and that's a newer nonprofit founded by actually a mathematician and cryptographer whose early work was on how to have trustworthy, accurate, safe voting anonymously, and then spent some time at Mozilla and has gone to found on Voting Rights. That one is currently focused more on the actual mechanics of getting safe voting hardware and software into the hands of local elections. So that's one. And I like the idea that election machines are not open source, to me, is abhorrent for that trustworthy piece. And I guess maybe I'll just go back a little bit. And what does open mean to me? I would probably put for open source software trustworthy. And the idea that we have trustworthy voting machines that aren't open source is just sort of crazy to me. So that's what I have off the top of my head on that one. And then on the education side, where I'm not, an educator, so I want to be careful and not overstep my knowledge. But I would say, I think we're pretty early in the process. It's easy to forget how much knowledge and courseware is now available that wasn't 20 years ago, before the open education movement. So that idea of progress, or the idea that even your reading list, or whatever it is, would be shared outside of your students, your paying students, right? Either paid in a university through tuition or paid by citizens, through our school systems. Was not well founded at the time. So I think that there have been a couple of changes. One is that curriculum can and should be available. But from what I've seen, we're still at the really early stages. Because to really have open education, there's both, can you learn, but the other piece of, can you get a credential? Or can you verify to others that you've learned and get credit in a marketplace or an employment setting for that? And so there's some systems. Mozilla helped launch an open badging system that was intended to do that, but I think we're still really early in that. Gotcha,
great. Let's see, I think the next question is an interesting one. So this comes from someone who's part of the Stanford Open Source Lab and has seen a lot of changes since 2007 or so, in that people who engage with open source don't think of it as maybe the same thing they used to. They've lost some of those founding principles, maybe of those early tight-knit communities. And now, as you said, to some people, open source means do anything you want. I suppose the question is, what's the best way to communicate our values around what open source should be compared to this new, oh, it just means I get to grab and take it?
Yeah. Well, first I'll start and say that this is a problem of success. The idea that open source is mainstream now means that, of course, there's tons of people who it's a practical, just kind of part of reality. And so I'm not sure that we're going to change that. I think that is actually a success condition. And I think the question, though, of how do we take the values that made it and apply them to today's issues? My talk today was a little bit about taking those values and extending them or evolving them to be more focused on today's issues. So I think that that's one way, because Oh, the thing about living in the market, which of course, with Firefox and, products, and many of you do too, you have to get to people where they are. It's, I think Mozilla's gone through a period in the last few years of wanting people to come to where we are about the open internet. And that's really hard to do. People have a lot on their mind. It's hard to get people to understand values if they don't see a problem. And so in that evolution of Mozilla, a big part of it is going out to where people are and what is their mindset and what are their problems. So that's one. And then another piece, which, Anil at Glitch is really quite eloquent about, is that we need to learn to speak a different language. And that the language of our history, and even the word the web or the open web, doesn't mean anything to most people. And open internet doesn't really capture it. And open source doesn't capture it anymore either because it's been so successful. And so what is the language of the set of people who are longing for the things that we've been trying to build in open source? Those longings are still there, but our language. And so another part of the evolution at Mozilla is going to be trying to learn how to speak that language.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point that is often overlooked among communities that think of themselves primarily as technical communities, learning empathetic language, empathetic vocabulary for communicating core values and ideas.
Yes, and for the self-reflection of how are those values or the problems they address expressed in the world today. I feel like, at least at Mozilla, we need to do a little bit of changing too.
Absolutely. I think we have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. There are two great questions that are both about ethics in the open source movement and even some proposed new licensing models. There's things like the, quote, ethical open source license that are designed to address concerns that have come up with open source software being used by large companies that might be doing harm with them in some way, by governments that might be using them in an oppressive way with their populations. Do you have thoughts about reconciling that with the other ideas we have around open, or is that one of the avenues we're exploring as we try and come up with these new definitions?
Yes, I think it's definitely one of the avenues we're exploring. What does accountability mean at these levels? So and I think it's a fascinating exploration because it allows us to go, to push even on the boundaries of what is open source. So we know what open source is, but ethical open source, has or suggests some other aspects that are important. And so I think as a community, the ability that we're able to think about these things without tearing each other apart is also a sign of success. In the early days, we fought over licenses. And we, as an broad open source community, broke into tribes, based on Apache or Mozilla, whatever it was. And finally, we made them all compatible and stopped doing that quite so much. So the ability that we can now begin to discuss these things with additional ideas in them without getting into purity debates is a massive success. So A, I think that's really important. B, the ethical piece, I struggle with a bit, in that it's hard to know what the implications of a piece of software are beforehand. Mm-hmm. Even when you try. And so, for example, let's take the internet. I mean, it's amazingly powerful. It's disrupted whole industries. Now it's disrupting democracy. If you knew all of that beforehand, what would you do? I don't know. So on that, now there are some things I want to be clear. There are some things that one can define early on as unethical, or you could have a license that laid them out that are very clear. And here's a set of things. So I think this exploration gets to one set of activities that at least the authors of a piece of software could agree these activities are unacceptable to us. And so I think that's a most excellent exploration. I think the broader question of what, is it, I don't know, today, is it ethical to have made combustion engines? Who could tell 200 years ago? Now, today we might. Today you might say, no, it is completely unethical. I feel it is unethical, and if there's a personal automobile, it cannot be gasoline powered, and you can't use anything I do for that. So today, totally clear. if someone used your software 25 years ago, like, how does that work? And so I think the question of what is ethical over time, and if software is put to uses one doesn't like over time, how do we handle that? You know, whether we call them ethical or whether we call them illegal or whether we call them obscene, you know, like any of those things, what do you do over time? And that, I think, is a pretty tough question. So lots of exploration there.
Yeah, that's a wonderful kind of conclusion, I think, to the questions we're able to take. We're out of time. I do want to ask you if you would do one more thing in closing. Is there an exhortation, a request that you would have of every individual who's seeing this message about how they should participate in this new exploration of open?
Yeah, I guess you surprise all your speakers with this question. I would say look for where change yourself is appropriate. Because there's a lot of things out in the world, and you know, there's no perfection, at least not on Earth. There's no perfection, and that's true of each one of us. And I think change as a community and then as a society, actually really being willing to change some deeply held view of one's own is a good modeling function.
I think that's a fantastic place to close. Thank you again, Mitchell. This has been a wonderful presentation and a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure we'll all carry it with us. Thank you in our audience, everyone, for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but we'll let you go, and please enjoy the rest of DrupalCon.
Thank you.